In this lesson, we're going to take a look at variables, and you can think of a variable kind of like shorthand inside of your expressions. It makes everything a lot more efficient, and it even makes your code easier to look at and just be able to read through. So let's take a look at an example. We're not going to do anything too exciting, but just to demonstrate what a variable is for, let's go into the transform controls and again go into the rotation. So let's start writing an expression here, holding down Alt and clicking on that stopwatch. And I want to give myself a little bit more room here, so let me just expand this up. And that way, this is just a little easier to see. Now, like I said, a variable is kind of like shorthand within your code. And let's say that I want to drive the rotation by the opacity property. So when the opacity changes, the rotation also changes. Well, we could do it the same way that we did before, which would be using the expression pick whip and then selecting the opacity value and just clicking off. And then After Effects will fill in the expression it needs to reference that property. So in the transform controls, looking at the opacity. And by the way, the reason why we don't have this comp, this layer, all of that extra stuff is because it's on the same layer. We're looking at the opacity property for the same layer. So After Effects is automatically assuming when we don't add in that this comp dot layer and then variables, it's assuming all of that is already there when you don't add any of it in. If you're not telling After Effects to reference a different layer or a different comp, then it's going to assume that we're dealing with the layer that you're writing the expression on. Anyway, let's just apply that. And now the rotation is directly corresponding to the opacity level from 0 to 100, 0 to 100 degrees. But I can also store this code in what's called a variable. So let's see how we can write that. Well, I'm going to leave this as it is and go before that code and type in var for variable and then a space. And then I need to give it a name. This will be what we use as the shorthand. So for opacity, I'm just going to use the variable O, just a lowercase letter O, and then another space equals space. And then at the very end of the line, I'm going to put a semicolon. And that's how you end a line of code in an expression. But altogether, this is just saying that I'm defining a variable, I'm calling it O, and that is going to equal the opacity transformation value whenever I reference that letter O, that variable, further down in my code. If I apply this, I'm actually going to get an expression error because this is not a valid expression. It's not giving After Effects any value. It's just a bit of code to reference another property. And if I click on this, it's going to give me the error right here. It's saying there's an undefined value used in this expression, meaning I'm not giving it a value with this code. So what I need to do is drop down a line, and maybe two just to give myself a little bit more room, and then put a value in. This can be a hard-coded value, so if I put 90 and clicked off, it's going to give me a value of 90. But I want it to be the opacity value, and I defined that as the letter O. So if I just select that 90 and I type lowercase o and put a semicolon to end that line of code, click off, there we go. That is now giving me the same value that I had before when I just used the expression pick whip. Now this on its own, obviously it's not saving me any time by defining that variable and then referencing that variable, because all I had to do to get this particular thing to work is grab this expression pick whip and click on opacity, and it does the exact same thing. I'll undo that. The power of this is when you're using much more complex expressions, which we're about to get into. Having this shorthand makes it much easier to just look at your expressions so you don't have long lines of code to wade through and get confused by, and it makes it a lot easier to write your expressions because you're just using whatever you define your variables as. Now, I realize this might all seem pretty abstract at this point. We're using very simple examples and they're not really doing anything, but trust me, once we start implementing them into our motion graphics templates, it's all gonna make sense and you're gonna be really glad that you knew about them before.